introduction to the Westminster Confession, and this will be divided into three shorter parts. So the first part. Now, I realize that not everybody watching this will be familiar with the ups and downs of the English Reformation, which is quite a complicated story. And so I'm going to give a brief survey of the key points. Whereas in many places when the Reformation came, they went from being Roman Catholic, they embraced the Reformation, and then they became Protestant, and that was more or less it. However, in England, it is a lot more complicated than that. So please bear with me. Well, the Reformation, of course, began with Luther. It began in 1517 when he posted up his 95 Theses. That's, if you like, the starting gun that set the race off. And then 4 years later, at the famous Diet of Worms, Luther was told to recant and stood up against the emperor. And although he didn't say these words, it sums up what he did say, here I stand, I can do no other. So there we have the launching of the Reformation. And one of the things that Luther attacked in those early years was the Roman Catholic doctrine of the seven sacraments. And he also, in particular, attacked the idea of the Eucharist, the Mass, is a sacrifice that we offer to God. And Luther called this a blasphemous doctrine. And one of his opponents fairly early on was King Henry VIII of England. And he wrote a treatise with possibly a little bit of help, but substantially his own work. He wrote a treatise defending the seven sacraments. This was in 1521. And here we have a sort of supreme irony. For this, he was rewarded by the Pope and given the title of Defender of the Faith, which is ironical because Henry was going to launch the Reformation and end the power of the authority of the Pope in England. And the even greater irony is that Henry, after he had done that, after the Reformation, he didn't give up this title, Defender of the Faith. And in fact, right down to this day, the British sovereigns still call themselves Defender of the Faith. And if you look at a British coin, it's now abbreviated to, it used to be Fidei Defender, short for Fidei Defender, and I think it's just FD now, so just the two letters. But it's still, British monarchs still call themselves Defender of the Faith because of Henry's defense of the seven sacraments. Okay, so Henry, I mentioned, was King of England. He was king from 1509 to 1547, so quite a time. Now, what do you think is the first duty of a monarch? Well, you might think defending the realm and so on, and that's all true, but there was an even greater duty that lay upon Henry. Let me explain. In the 15th century, there had been various civil wars in England over the disputed succession as who was the lawful king, because different people had different claims because of the way they were descended, from whom they were descended. And then Henry VII started the Tudor dynasty in the 1470s. And the prime duty of Henry VIII as his successor was to give birth, or to generate a legitimate male heir. He had to produce a male heir so as to avoid the danger of further civil war and strife. Now, Henry in 1509 married Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And it was a happy marriage. They were married for the best part of 25 years, but there was a problem. They had only one surviving child, Mary, who, as the name indicates, was female. This wasn't completely Henry's fault because he had managed in his various affairs on the side, as monarchs tended to do in those days, he managed to produce a son illegitimately, but of course that son was illegitimate and could not succeed to the throne. Now, Henry asked himself, why is this happening? And there was a little bit of a problem because Catherine had previously been married to Henry's older brother. Henry's older brother, Arthur, who was meant to be the next king, he had married at a young age, married Catherine. They'd been married for a year, and then Arthur died. And so Henry became now the heir. And so Henry eventually became king when his father died, and at that point he married Catherine. So, so what, you might say, what does that matter? Well, I'll tell you why it matters. Leviticus 18:16 says that you should not marry your brother's wife. And Leviticus 20:21 goes further and says that if you do that, then you will be childless. There will be no children. Well, Henry did have a child with Catherine, Mary, but as far as he was concerned, because at that stage, there'd only been one example of a female ruler in England, and that had been disastrous. That had led to a civil war, and effectively because she wasn't accepted. So Mary wasn't going to be good enough. He needed a son. Why didn't he have a son? Why was God not giving him a son? Well, there it is in Leviticus. Now, the Pope had given him a dispensation to allow him to marry his brother's wife, or widow, I should say. But Henry thought, now, God hasn't accepted this because I don't have an heir. Normally, this wouldn't have been a problem. Henry would have gone metaphorically, sent people to Rome to explain the situation, and the Pope would have given him an annulment and said, hey, this marriage is not a genuine marriage, you must marry again. But there was a problem with that. Catherine's nephew, Charles V of Spain, was the Holy Roman Emperor, the one who was the nominal head of all states, embracing the many states making up what is now called Germany and a bit more as well. So he had the Pope within his power militarily. He was in Italy and in control of the Pope. And he wasn't going to take very kindly to the Pope declaring that his aunt's marriage was invalid. And so the Pope's hands were tied. So there was a problem there. There was another issue. Henry, as I've already intimated, had various affairs on the side. And there was a young lady at court called Anne Boleyn, who wasn't going to play along with that and said, either I become your wife or forget it. And so she wasn't going to settle for any less than marriage. And Henry needed a legitimate heir, so a marriage it had to be. Well, how is that going to be managed? Well, Henry basically got round the situation by arranging for the marriage with Catherine to be annulled within England itself. How could he do that? Well, by passing laws removing the authority of the Pope in England. And eventually Henry was declared the supreme head of the church in England under God. Right, so why did Henry want to do that? Well, as I said, for him, the burning issue was the need for an heir. But the people who helped him with this, encouraged him and facilitated this, had rather different motivations. The annulment stroke divorce was arranged by Cranmer, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was appointed to that role because he had a solution to Henry's problem. And so Thomas Cranmer, who was a convinced Protestant, went into that role as being Archbishop of Canterbury. And another Thomas Cromwell, was Henry's sort of equivalent of what today you call a prime minister. He was Henry's chief minister who did everything for him. And Thomas Cromwell, again, was a convinced Protestant. And both of them were working with Henry, doing what he wanted, but with their aim was to bring about a Protestant England. And obviously, a first step in that was the breach with Rome. So that was affected, and I once or twice mentioned the word divorce, which isn't strictly correct, because Henry didn't divorce Catherine strictly, although it's often referred to that way. The declaration was that the marriage had always been invalid. Now, you might think, that's a small distinction, but it's a rather important one, because if he had divorced her, Mary, his daughter, would have still been his legitimate daughter. But because the marriage was annulled, Mary was declared a bastard, an illegitimate child, and therefore not unable to be the heir to the throne. And obviously Mary didn't particularly like that, and we'll come back to that in a little while. Well, during Henry's reign, there was a real but limited progress of Reformation. Stops and starts, it would go forward a bit, then back a bit, but generally the country was moving in a direction towards becoming more Protestant. Then Henry died in 1547, and his son Edward took over. Now, let me explain. I'm sorry, I need to backtrack slightly here. I mentioned that the annulment with Catherine, his marriage with Catherine was annulled, but then he married Anne Boleyn, who I mentioned, to whom he was very strongly attracted and who demanded marriage. And they had a daughter, Elizabeth, but Anne was also unable to produce a son. She had a miscarriage, and then there were various court intrigues, and Henry, I think, was getting a little bit cross with the way she was behaving and so on. And so Anne's fall was brought about. I put it like that. She was accused of committing adultery with various men, including her brother. And she was convicted of this. Who knows the truth? She was convicted of this and executed. And then Henry married again another young girl from the court to whom he was attracted, called Jane Seymour. And they did have a son, Edward. But sadly for Jane, she died not actually in childbirth, but shortly after, from complications of fever and so on. So now Henry had three legitimate children. Mary, well, as I say, sort of legitimate, depending on your view of the annulment. Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. And Henry, in his will, passed the throne on, said that the order of succession should be Edward, who is the male heir, would be the first choice. And if Edward were to die without any children, then Mary should take his place. And if she should die without any children, it should be Elizabeth. And that, in fact, is exactly what happened, because none of them had any children. And so the succession went in that order. Now, there were three further wives, but so Henry had a colourful domestic life, but none of those are particularly relevant to our story, so we'll pass them over. So Edward became king in 1547, and during his time, the Reformation gathered pace. He was a child. He wasn't even a teenager when he first became king. So he was a child, but genuinely seemed to have Protestant convictions. And two significant points, which will come up later in our story. In 1553, under Edward, they produced 42 articles, the 42 articles of the Church of England. And these were thoroughly reformed in their doctrine. That is to say, they were very clearly Protestant and not Catholic, but also within Protestantism, they favored the Reform, later called Calvinist doctrine, rather than Lutheran. And then the other significant achievement is the Book of Common Prayer. This was a revision of the traditional Catholic liturgy and retained much of the form, the structure of the traditional liturgy, but with two very important changes. First, it was in English. The Catholic liturgy was all in Latin. And so now it was in English so that the ordinary people could understand it. And secondly, the actual content, the teaching, what was being put over, was very clearly Protestant and Reformed. Now, during the time of Edward, the Reformation was mostly from the top down, and there was significant opposition to it from ordinary people for a whole variety of reasons, and rebellions and so on, the imposition of the Book of Common Prayer. Edward died sadly at the age of 15, a young man still, barely an adult, in 1553. And so, according to Henry's will, the throne now went to Mary, who reigned for 5 years. Mary was firmly Roman Catholic. For her, the Reformation meant the annulment of her mother's marriage, herself being declared a bastard, so it didn't exactly endear her to Protestantism. And she had very strong Roman Catholic convictions. And so she worked hard to restore Roman Catholicism in England. Well, they might have succeeded in that, but they made various mistakes. She and Archbishop of Canterbury, and probably the biggest mistake was the burning of heretics. For some hundreds of years, the Roman Catholic Church in Western Europe had a policy that if you guilty of heresy and you refused to recant, you'd be burned at the stake, burned alive. Pretty horrific. And this happened in a spasmodic way over a period of time. However, during the reign of Mary, over 200 people were burned in just a few years, which was completely unprecedented. Most of them were ordinary folk, but again, unprecedented. 4 of them were bishops. There's Bishop Hooper, who was a bit of a firebrand, but then there were also Bishops Latimer and Ridley, who were perhaps more at the heart of more central to the regime, if you like, and they died bravely together in Oxford. They were burned at the stake. And then finally, there was Cranmer, the Archbishop, who had seen through the Reformation, who had been the one who had helped to bring about the end of Catherine's marriage to Henry. And these people died bravely, and you could say that Mary, by having all these burnings, burnt Protestantism into the English psyche, because it made Roman Catholicism very unpopular. And that wasn't helped by the fact that she was married to King Philip II of Spain. And that was also not popular, because the English didn't want to be ruled by Spain. Her life ended rather tragically in 1558, when she died under the illusion that she was pregnant, which it was a phantom pregnancy, and she died childless. And by great irony, her Archbishop of Canterbury also died the same night. So there was a clean sweep there. And so the throne went to Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, whose very identity was linked to Protestantism. That's how she came to become queen. And very quickly, things were restored, the state of religion in England was restored to how it had been at the end of Edward's reign. So the effects of Mary's reign was sort of wiped out. And the one significant difference from earlier on, in that Elizabeth was called the Supreme Governor of the Church of England, and not Supreme Head, which a title which had caused some offence. So she restored things to how they were at the end of Edward's reign, but significant, she blocked any further reform. Under Edward, the Reformation was on a journey, and it ended up where it did in the end of his 5 years, but it was progressively becoming more reformed, and it would have carried on becoming even more so. However, Elizabeth determined that it should stop at that point. Now, when Mary was queen, those who are Protestant within England, leading figures like bishops and so on, or other leading figures, that they basically had one various choices. They could conform, as Elizabeth herself did, and simply outwardly go along with the Roman Catholic regime under Mary, or they could go into exile. And a significant number went to Zurich, where under the reform of Bullinger, Heinrich Bullinger, successor of Zwingli. And of those people who went there, many of those became bishops under Elizabeth. That was very much the favored approach under Elizabeth. Those who were more radical went to Geneva, where Calvin was. And they were not in favor with Elizabeth for two reasons. The first is a rather sort of incidental one, because at Geneva, John Knox, who was Scottish, he during the reign of Queen Mary, he wrote a book called The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment or Rule of Women. And it was aimed at Mary, but Elizabeth, as a woman, did not altogether appreciate it. And Calvin was not aware of Knox's writing this, and he tried to smooth over the troubled waters, but without success. But the other aspect was that those who went to Geneva were more radical. Those at Zurich were happy to go along with the role of the state leading the church, whereas in Geneva, Calvin had fought hard for the independence, relative independence and freedom of the church. And that was not what Elizabeth wanted. She wanted to control the church. So those who've been at Geneva were somewhat out of favor. And so what we have a situation under Elizabeth, the Church of England is clearly reformed, but it still has bishops, unlike most of the continental reformed churches. And it has a liturgy which still has a sort of Catholic form to it, even if the content was very Protestant. And so there were a group called Puritans who were wanting a further reform in the Church of England. And indeed, most of Elizabeth's bishops wanted further reform, but were blocked. And the Puritans were those who were prepared to be awkward and disobey if necessary. Well, in 1603, Elizabeth died, unmarried, no children. And so the throne went to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. Let me explain. England and Scotland were obviously next door to each other, but they were quite independent countries, like, say, Cambodia and Vietnam. They were separate countries, but next door to each other. And now what happened is they remained separate countries. They had their own parliaments and so on, but now the King of Scotland became also the King of England. He wasn't the King of Great Britain because there was no Great Britain. There was simply England and Scotland, and he was king of these two independent countries. And so, as I say, they continued to have their own parliaments. And James continued the same policy as Elizabeth, and continued with the reform situation, but did not allow any further change. So things remained as they were. Now, during this time, Roman Catholicism was becoming increasingly unpopular. When Elizabeth was queen, the Pope in 1570 excommunicated her and released Roman Catholics from any duty to obey her, potentially turning every English Roman Catholic into a traitor. So that didn't go down well. In 1588, Spain, which was the superpower of the time, sent a huge armada of ships to invade England. And that was a catastrophic failure, but again led to the hatred of and fear of Roman Catholicism. And finally, under James himself, in 1605, an English Catholic called Guy Fawkes with others sought to blow up the king and parliament all together by putting gunpowder under in the vaults of the House of Parliament, and the plot was discovered. But again, this was how Roman Catholicism was perceived. So, as I mentioned, there was still the Puritans within the Church of England, those who wanted further reform and wanted to bring the Church of England more in line with continental Reformed churches. Well, we come to the very last stage of this introduction now with when James died, his son Charles took over in 1625. And he upset the balance because, first of all, he married a French Roman Catholic queen. So that wasn't very popular. Secondly, as was happening in the 17th century, he believed in the divine right of kings, that he could rule and that nobody else had any say in it. And he, for many years, he did rule without calling parliament. So he was just like a dictator. And then even worse, he tried to shift the Church of England from being a Reformed church and to make it more Catholic in its liturgy and less Reformed and Calvinist in its doctrines. And he appointed an Archbishop of Canterbury, Laud, who aimed to do that and brought in, persecuted those who were more Protestant. Then Charles made a fatal mistake. In 1637, he endeavored to impose the bishops and the Book of Common Prayer on the Scots. And they were having none of it. And so they declared war. And so we had a war between England and Scotland. And at that point, Charles had to call the English Parliament to get money to wage war. And so in 1640, there was finally, after over 10 years, a parliament called the Long Parliament, because they continued right the way through to the end of the 1640s. And 1642, there was civil war between Parliament and King. And that brings us up to our next session on the actual background of the Westminster Assembly, because in 1643, 1 year later, Parliament called the Westminster Assembly. And that will be the next part of our story.